In this lesson, what I want to do is talk about some of the economic developments that takes place during this Gilded Age period of American history. So we finished the last lesson by looking at the position of African Americans, we looked at the regional divisions that existed, and we looked at the more general social divisions. Now we're going to build on some of the things that we spoke about in the previous lesson, and we're going to talk more generally about the ideas relating to the economy in the Gilded Age. We'll talk about the development of new technologies, which is something that we focused on a little bit in the end of the last lesson. And we will talk about the growth of various monopolistic enterprises. We'll talk about what this actually means, and we will talk about how this impacted the US economy during this period. So specifically, we're focusing on industrial policy, and we will talk about the rise of monopolies in this lesson as well. We'll explain what monopolies are very briefly as well at some point for those who are not studying economics and haven't got any kind of grasp on the economic ideas that we are going to need to understand for this lesson. So let's think about the developments in industry beginning first. So we see that during the period of the Gilded Age, we do see a quite significant amount of industrial development taking place. And it takes place for a number of different reasons. We see, for example, improved communications, in particular, the development of railroads. The reason why the development of railroads is so important is that it paves the way for the possibility to exploit natural resources, and it makes it easier for in communications and connections between different areas of the US state. The USA was also growing through the westward expansion, the idea of the manifest destiny that we focused on in the last lesson, and the massive migration of individuals westward. Because there was more people moving west, that meant there was more land to grow crops, to farm, and to therefore contribute to the economy. There was more resources to exploit through industry as we continue to move west, and all of this contributes massively to the development of the US economy, which in turn contributes to industrialization, which in turn contributes to massive westward expansion. So it's almost like a cycle that goes through. There was also optimism, which encouraged risk-taking and entrepreneurship. We see more of an optimism in relation to the growth of economic development, and so therefore people were more likely to take risks during this period. Not all of these risks would eventually pay off, but those that did pay off would lead to massive profits and massive growth in entrepreneurship, all of which contributes to the broader US economy. For example, we see individuals like Andrew Carnegie and people like J.P. Morgan, who were known to be very successful industrialists, and they were more celebrated as role models than that of the corrupt and the weak politicians who were around at the time. And so more people were taking on the ideas of these individuals and taking on as role models, viewing these individuals more and more as role models, more so than that of the politicians. So in talking about industrial developments and in talking about communication developments, connection developments, and industrial developments, we have to think about railroads. Railroads would see a huge growth in the years following the Civil War. For example, 40,000 miles of track would be laid between 1830 and 1870, which is of course the period before and during the Civil War. But we also see 110,000 miles being laid down in the following 20 years. So between 1830 and 1870, we only see around 40,000 miles of track, with 110,000 being laid between 1870 and 1890, a significant increase, and so therefore showing just how rapid the industrial development of railroads actually was. We see the first transcontinental railway be completed in 1869. By 1900, there were 5 transcontinental railways. So in just 39 years, we see the development. In just 29 years, we see the development of around 5 transcontinental railways. The first being completed in 1869. While the railroads were private companies, their growth was facilitated by massive land grants from the federal government. So one of the things that's quite interesting is the fact that they were commercialized industries. They were commercialized businesses that were private companies that were developing these railroads, but they were doing so under the facilitation of massive federal government grants that were essentially helping invest in these railroads, not only in order to help grow the development of railroads, which we see take place, but also this would have what are known as positive externalities. This is a phrase that we would use in economics. Essentially, it would cost the federal government a certain amount of money to facilitate the massive land grants to help build these railroads, but it was seen that the externalities, the external contributors, would actually be a net positive for the federal government. So the development of these railroads and the ability to connect the country in a way that had never been connected before was seen as something that was going to be economically advantageous for the federal government. So it was worth the investment in the development of these railroad companies. The railroad led to the introduction of common time zones in the USA in 1883. They were also indirectly responsible for the development of the transcontinental telegraph system, also contributing to the communications deficit that existed, the closing of the gap in communications, making it quicker for you to communicate across the country. The problem that we have, and the problem that we have in all of these industries across the entire period of the Gilded Age, is the fact that these private railroad companies were corrupt. So a huge sum necessary for railway construction was required for the development of these railways, and the finances were often unstable in the development of these structures. During the period of economic depression that we see between 1873 and 1879, around a quarter of the railroads would fail. So showing that because of the financial instability of the railroads that are developing, any kind of economic hit that they would take, i.e. a depression that takes place between 73 and 79, would cause a number of them to ultimately fail. In addition to the railroads, we also have developments when it comes to oil and steel. The most successful oil firm was known as the Standard Oil Company of Cleveland, founded by John D. Rockefeller in 1870. Rockefeller being, I believe, one of the richest human beings in all of history. It would embrace modern technologies, and it would also embrace ruthless business practices to ensure that by 1879 it controlled 90% of the oil in the USA. This is what is known as a monopoly. We'll get to what a monopoly is here. So when we think about markets within an economy, there are often a number of different actors within a particular market, let's say the oil market, for example, and they often compete with each other for and vie for profits, essentially. Now, a monopoly is what happens when you have an entire market, the entire market share, owned by a single company. So when the Rockefeller industry, the Standard Oil Company, owns 90% of the oil industry in the United States, it means that it is an effective monopoly. It means that we see the monopolization of that particular market. No other industry, no other private company can have any kind of input within that market. Now, the reason why this is problematic is that if 90% of oil is controlled by one private firm in the United States, it means that that private firm can do essentially whatever it wants, because the demand for the oil will never, ever, ever leave that company, because there is no other alternatives. So everyone is still going to demand the oil, they're still going to need the oil, but there is only one supplier, that being the Standard Oil Company. So they can raise prices, and we would still have to buy the oil. They can cut corners, and we would still have to buy the oil. All of these things means that essentially competition, number one, competition dies, so there are no other oil companies that can compete, and B, it means that this oil company essentially becomes a a de facto a de facto law on itself. Essentially, it becomes able to impose whatever restrictions it likes, given the fact that there is no other alternatives for those who need oil. We need oil, and so therefore we have to get oil from this Standard Oil company because we have no other alternatives. And if they want to raise the prices, we have no alternatives but to pay for that. So this is why a monopoly is a bad idea. We have also within economics, within microeconomics, the idea of an oligopoly, which is similar to a monopoly, but rather than one industry, rather than one private enterprise controlling 100% of the market share, it's controlled by maybe 2 or 3 of these individual companies. And then when we have full competition, we have no one private firm owning a certain percentage of the market share of a particular industry. When we think about steel, the steel industry was dominated by Andrew Carnegie, and the steel mills at Pittsburgh were responsible for 70% of the nation's output by 1890. Again, another monopoly, essentially a monopoly, slightly less market share than that of Standard Oil and Rockefeller's, but still a ridiculous amount of market share. Much of this steel would go to and contribute to the development of the railroads. These are the consequences of unregulated capitalism in regard to the development of these big companies and the monopolization of these markets. And this contributes to the rise of corporations. When Andrew Carnegie sold its steel company in 1901 to J.P. Morgan, steel became the first billion-dollar corporation. U.S. Steel was the first billion-dollar corporation. The growth of giant corporations had been a feature of the U.S. Industrial Revolution, the industrial development that the U.S. experienced, in which one company would control all of the productive processes and the manufacture of a single product. So by 1904, for example, the largest 4% of US companies were responsible for 57% of the total production in the United States. A huge disparity in terms of production, and as a result of that, a huge disparity in terms of wealth production, in terms of profit. The General Electricity, controlled 85% of the nation's output by the turn of the century, another monopoly. The growth of these monopolies and oligopolies made it very difficult for any kind of competition, and it meant that the distribution of wealth among private corporations would be very, very little, as all of these massive corporations would begin to accumulate wealth within their own particular businesses, meaning that essentially what we're doing here is making people like Andrew Carnegie and people like J.P. Morgan and people like Rockefeller incredibly rich individuals at the expense of everybody else.